In this section on biological anthropology, I'll be discussing evolutionary theory and the progression of evolutionary ideas, particularly in European thought and scholarship overall. We often think of evolution as associated with Charles Darwin, who you can see pictured here. And of course, Darwin's influence on evolution was fairly dramatic, but he built on a number of earlier scholars in evolutionary theory and thought overall. So what I'll be discussing in this particular recorded lecture here is an overview of the evolution of evolutionary theory as a whole. And whereas we certainly see the influence, the imprint of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, as well as their influence in terms of social theorists, we see that Darwin's work actually builds on a number of earlier scholars and actually individuals that are outside of the scholarly realm before we get to universities overall. Really, the story starts in terms of thinking about our human condition in a very broad sense. So we're going to be looking at the great chain of being, which is derived from Aristotelian principles. From there, we'll move into a discussion of Plato and his idea of essentialism. We'll continue on and look at a number of different theorists, including Linnaeus's binomial nomenclature, but also particularly note that he also viewed species as unchanging over time. Cuvier's catastrophism, uniformitarianism of Charles Lyell, the idea of transformational evolution by Lamarck. Finally, we get to variational evolution by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and its influence on social theorists, including Spencer, Morgan, and Tyler. The great chain of being was derived from Aristotelian principles that were elaborated during the Middle Ages. Essentially, the great chain of being argues that every kind of living organism was linked to every other kind of human organism, and that humans were somewhere between spirits and flesh. Now, the great chain of being represents God's perfect creation without any gaps at all. You can see here that all creatures on the planet essentially are arranged, and even outside of the planet on the sort of supernatural realm, you can see here the notion of divinity, the archangels, the angels, humans between the spirit and the flesh here, and then further and further down until you get to trees, which are rooting into the earth. And the earth is seen, of course, as a potentially dangerous place. And you have to keep in mind that the development of the great chain of being over time and how it's thought about, of course, the forest was a very dangerous place at that time. We also see a potential fall of grace here of individuals from heavens, the fall of angels, and descending into essentially hell. And of course, the trees also penetrating the earth and its associations with evil overall. So you have to remember at this time, of course, again, the forest was a very dangerous place overall. The key thing to remember here for our purposes, though, is that that this is a rather static rendition in terms of thinking about the order of the universe. That is, things are not progressing, rather they are divinely ordained. They were created in a particular way, and they still exist in this particular way to this day. Plato's notion of essentialism. Plato had a belief in fixed ideas or forms that exist in perfect and unchanging in eternity. That is, there were two types or two worlds, the ideal and the material world. For Plato, there was the material world, wherein actual objects in the temporal world are seen as imperfect material realizations of the ideal. In turn, the ideal is the form that defines their kind. So in essence here, what we have is what we're seeing on Earth are imperfect material realizations. So you could think about this in terms of things like a photocopy. You get an original, it's very clear, and then you start to make copies of it, and it degrades over time based on the actual copying process and whatnot. You get imperfect material realization. So everything that we see on Earth is in fact an imperfect material realization of this ideal form of the particular organism. So this ideal horseness or this ideal cowness, for example. So there's this ideal cow, and then everything that we see on Earth is essentially an imperfect material realization of that. So this explains variation as in essence a well, an imperfection of the ideal form overall. Linnaeus lived from 1707 to 1778. He is probably best known for his work in binomial nomenclature, a Système Naturel, where in 1735, where he provides a systematic, organized framework for the classification of life forms. But the key thing with Linnaeus in terms of evolutionary theory is he believed in the immutability of the species, and that life forms were in fact created by God, and they could not change over time. So you have here a very static view of all life on the planet as, again, following the great chain of being, or the notion of essentialism from Plato, this ideal form, the static nature overall. We start to see some shifts here with Benoit DeMolay from 1656 to 1738. In 1748, you have published his work, which is based on collections between 1722 and 1732. It's called Telemed, or actually his name in reverse, DeMolay, or Discourses between an Indian Philosopher and French Missionary on the diminution of the sea, the formation of the earth, and the origins of men and animals, etc. So what DeMolay is attempting to do here is he positions himself as the so-called Indian philosopher in the context of this book. And he's having this debate with a French missionary, which essentially represents the scientific order of the day. Now, DeMolay comes up with some interesting things, and many of these we would look at and we would say, well, this just actually isn't scientific in any sense today. But he comes to some of the right conclusions for the wrong reasons overall. One of the first conclusions that he comes to is that the age of the earth is older than expected. And this has to do with what you see in the title, the diminution of the sea. So for DeMolay, he fundamentally believes that the rate of decline of sea level occurs at a steady rate over time, and that with every year you can essentially measure this. And based on this, the age of the earth is older than expected. Now, what DeMolay also noted, though, in the fossil record was he was seeing some things that existed in the fossil record that he didn't see any analogs for in the material world that was around him. And this indicated to him that, in fact, some species had gone extinct. And this is a fundamental break from earlier theorists who noted that, well, things like God's perfect creation without gaps, that things were static, that things were unchanging. Here you have the idea put forth that, in fact, things had changed, that some species had gone extinct. And this is a fairly dramatic shift overall. Georges Louis Lerc, Comte de Buffon, from 1707 to 1788. He wrote Histoire naturelle, generale in particular, from 1749 to 1788. He fundamentally followed this notion of degeneration from the Tower of Babel, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But his key observations was that there were physical variations between the species and that different animals had, in fact, underlying structural similarities. DeMolay, or Comte de Buffon, he comes up with one of the first really key and essential ideas. Actually, this is a key idea in the contemporary environmental movement today, the connections between things like food supply and population, or more broadly speaking, resources and population as a whole. And this actually ends up leading into probably one of the more famous statements of this by a scholar by the name of Thomas Malthus in his essay on population, which first comes out in 1796. And he talks about how the power of population is essentially exponential, that it grows 2 times 2 times 2, etc., whereas the power of the earth to produce food is arithmetic. That is 1 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 ad infinitum. And so there's no opportunity for the ability of humans to supply for food in the long run. Essentially, Malthus's argument, the power of population will outstrip the power of humans to provide for themselves, leading to war, pestilence, and disease. What de Buffon also notices, following from earlier scholarship, is that in fact some species are going extinct. Cuvier's notion of catastrophism in 1812, he notes that some species had gone extinct in massive natural disasters. But what he essentially explains for how they get replaced, well, essentially new species are introduced from elsewhere. Charles Lyell, a lot of his work underlies many of our conceptualizations of archaeology as well as biological anthropology in terms of looking at different strata or different layers within the soil and notions of stratigraphic superposition, which we'll talk about later in this course. For Lyell, between 1797 and 1875, his work on uniformitarianism, which he developed between 1830 and 1833, he maintained that current processes can be used essentially to reconstruct the past history of the Earth, in that, and based on the assumption that the same gradual processes of both erosion and uplift that changed the Earth's surface today had also been at work in the past. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck from 1744 to 1829, along with Erasmus Darwin, who is Charles Darwin's grandfather, comes up with a notion of transformational evolution. This assumes an essentialist species and a uniform environment. For Lamarck, as well as Erasmus Darwin to a lesser extent, each individual member of a species transforms itself in order to meet the challenges of a changed environment through the laws of use and disuse, a proposition of use it or lose it, and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That is, the inheritance of characteristics that are acquired over the course of a lifetime of a particular organism. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Charles Darwin had done extensive work on the HMS Beagle, documenting the development of his theory of evolution by means of natural selection, or what is also referred to as variational evolution. However, he was very reluctant to publish such information, given, in fact, Charles Darwin's own religious background. In 1859, however, he decided to publish with who was an individual who was a rather young upstart in comparison to Darwin in terms of the amount of work that he had done, Alfred Russel Wallace. And a lot of this had to do with Lamarck's comments to Darwin that warning him that Wallace was essentially going to publish with or without him. So the two of these individuals got together and they fundamentally changed the course of scientific history, challenged Lamarckian notions. There's an interesting discussion of this in Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he talks about some of the tension that exists between Lamarckian evolutionary theorists and Darwinian evolutionary theorists. Nevertheless, Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution by variational evolution by natural selection, they believe that in each generation there are variants that are born. Variants that are more successful or fitter will survive and produce more offspring who in turn will inherit the traits that made their parents fit. Now, in a Darwinian sense or in a variational evolutionary sense, fitness is a measure of an organism's ability to compete in a struggle for existence. It's interesting to note, too, that Darwin was not the individual that coined the term survival of the fittest. According to Darwin and Wallace, the principles of variational evolution are as follows. First, variation, that no two individuals are the same. Second, heredity, offspring will resemble their parents. And finally, natural selection, which is two parts. Every generation, variant individuals are generated within a species due to random genetic mutations. Those varied individuals which are best suited to the current environment will survive and produce more offspring. Here you can see an example of adaptive radiation in the Galapagos Island of the finches that Charles Darwin used to support his theory overall. Now, how does this tie into cultural systems overall? Because we see within anthropology a holistic approach where the different subfields actually inform one another. In an early explanation of cultural diversity, you have this notion of degenerationism. And in degenerationism, this was a biblical cause for degeneration in human society as a whole, where the Tower of Babel essentially is destroyed by God, and all people at the time when they were building the tower belonged to a single civilization. God destroys the tower, creating differences in language and dispersing the people. Some degenerate